fact a great honor to be here, and it's especially a great honor to be here at the Hertie School, which is I speak as old public policy schools in new public policy schools, and the exciting and innovative and novel things that are going on here, I think, will be lessons to us all. And so the kinds of issues that have to be addressed in today's world are so stunningly important and complex, and if we're not careful, if we let them go much longer, may well put us in a position that will be very, very hard to get past. So the fact that the school is up and running and doing such marvelous things, it's terrifically wonderful to be here. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about social policy. I'll do this in the context of someone who was deeply engaged in a reform that is now a decade old. And therefore we do have some lessons from it. But I also would like to move quickly to some lessons and some ideas that might go forward. Now, let me start with a very brief anecdote that's relevant for the current political season. Part of the way I got involved with welfare, what was called welfare reform, and I'll explain that a little better in a moment, during the Bill Clinton administration, was I had worked all my life actually on a set of issues like this. And indeed, our social welfare system, which was predominantly focused on lone parents, was blamed for many of the evils of the world. Near as I could tell, all bad things came from the existence of this relatively small program. And indeed, there is a fellow by the name of Charles Murray, who wrote a book that essentially said the reason poverty started getting worse in the United States is we tried fighting it. And in so doing, we actually made it worse. We created such adverse incentives that a lot of people ended up getting into the poverty habit and getting stuck there because of the adverse incentives. My own work had been done that suggested something quite different from that. A lot of it was work in collaboration with a woman by the name of Mary Jo Bain. And indeed, I found myself during some of this period. This is caused by the interaction of a BlackBerry. Hang on, wait a second. So I actually have been on talk shows defending the welfare system. Those of you that know America, I've been on Oprah Winfrey. Interesting experience, I should say. But I also have to tell you that there was few experiences in life less pleasant than going on these shows and defending the welfare system. This was a system of basically financial supports for low-income folks, primarily single parents. And I basically said, look, it hasn't caused dramatic changes in the family. It hasn't affected people's work behavior very much. And what was striking on these talk shows is it was not only did you get a fair number of angry phone calls, it's that you never got one single friendly phone call. Lots of women on welfare would call you up and tell you you were drunk. That you had no idea what you were talking about, Professor Ellwood. And, you know, these were the people whose honor I thought I was defending. And so I did find myself sort of wondering, what is it about our current system of supports that made so many people angry? And the welfare recipients themselves will talk about how they felt like it made them lazy or created various problems and the like. So I eventually went to work and decided that the fundamental problem was that it was not reinforcing the right values. We were in the check writing business instead of the business of trying to help people help themselves. And that was a fundamental difference. And I ultimately wrote a short paper called Reducing Poverty by Replacing Welfare. It was a short version of a longer book. And a person on a commission that I wrote the paper for, called the National Commission on Children, was a fellow by the name of Bill Clinton. And he really liked the paper. So this is like a good thing. I saw Bill Clinton at a National Governors Association meeting before he ran for president, but when it looked like he might. And he ran up to me and just said, "Oh, David, you know, this paper is just so great. I love this paper. It's really, really helpful." He said, "Look, I've got it here. I've marked it up all over. You can see I've got my marks everywhere." He shit me. "Oh, wait, this is Hillary's copy." Even then, I knew. that he wasn't the only Clinton. Well, that has echoes in the current election. When Clinton did run for president, he actually used a lot of the lines from some of that work. And let me highlight a couple of those things. And so there were three major elements in that we talked about. One was the starting point in terms of supporting folks was making work pay. Since the goal for most folks was to get a job and have a job that gave them some real independence and some real control, making work pay was the natural starting point. And so that meant things like an earned income tax credit, which many of you know about, but I'm going to come back to. But essentially, it's like a pay raise for working poor folks. It gave an extra 40 cents for every dollar you earn. The government added another 40 cents onto the top of that up to a maximum. And that had a huge, huge impact. It involved things like minimum wage, more health care benefits, child care benefits, a series of things to support working people when they're working. Now, that doesn't seem that novel, but in fact, it's very novel. Generally speaking, social policy has been designed to help the people that couldn't work or weren't working or had lost their jobs, who were unemployed and the like, and typically was designed to take money away as you earned more money because, of course, you were less needy. An earned income tax credit, by contrast, gives you, the more you earn, the more you get up to a maximum. So it's a very different kind of thing. Make work pay. A second element, which I won't focus as much on, but it was saying that one parent can't be expected to do the entire job of two. It was a recognition that lone parents need to have some additional sources of support in the current economy, ideally from the non-custodial parent, but if necessary through what I call child support insurance. And the third element involved going from a situation whereby the system of the welfare system was not primarily about writing checks and was primarily about helping people help themselves. One quick anecdote from that experience as well. One of the things that I actually we required of those of us that were working on welfare reform was that every single person involved in the work at the government level had to spend at least one day in a welfare office watching how it worked, how the public assistance systems work, and have one focus group with people that are on public assistance. And the reason for that was it was to clear out all the, what I would call the garbage, the simplistic garbage. People on the left all thought that, gee, the welfare system was just great and everything was perfect, why was anybody complaining? People on the right said, geez, these people are just lazy, what's the problem? And both came away saying, oh my gosh, people really hate the welfare system, it's not working, it's a problem, it's awful, it's really humiliating and stigmatizing. And people on the right said, oh my gosh, these people have really tough lives, it's complicated, it's hard, and so forth. And as a result, we were able to think about some alternative challenges going forward. Most fundamentally, this business about being in the wrong business. I talked to one welfare recipient, and she said the following. She said, look, I've been on and off welfare for about a dozen years. She said, I've been in a welfare office, dozens and dozens of times. Said, never once in that entire time did anyone ask me what I thought would always be the first question. What's the problem and how can I help? They instead said, here's the form you fill out for your food stamps, here's what you got to do to get your medical card and so forth. She said, I was happy to have those things, but it really wasn't what I really needed, and it certainly wasn't what I really wanted. She said, now I'm being trained to be a welfare worker, and I've learned they weren't supposed to ask those questions, so I feel better. I asked another person that ran a welfare office, I said, I figured out that someone to get on, just to get assistance, was going to have to see 6 or 7 people. And I asked the head of the office, who's the highest paid of those 7 people? And she said, the person that does verifications. I said, what's verifications? Verifications is the person that makes sure that you brought in your paycheck, your rent stubs, birth certificates, all of the paper evidence of what your situation really is. And I said, so why does the person that does verifications get the most money? And he said, well, that's obvious, because it's the hardest job. And my reaction is, if we think the hardest job of helping people that are struggling is making sure they've got their birth certificates in, we're fundamentally misguided. And so the idea was to really change towards a different strategy. Well, I'm not going to go into great detail. The thought there was to have time limits It was to encourage people to do education, training, and the like, to fundamentally get into the business of helping people get jobs, not just write checks. But here is one of the more controversial elements. The question is this: suppose you say to someone, we really want you to get a job. We're going to really make work pay. We're going to really make it worth your while, so you're much better off working than not working. And then someone doesn't get a job. What do you do? Do you sort of say, okay, well, that's fine, we'll let it go on forever? Do you say, well, this wasn't going to last forever, we're going to make it time limit the way many UI systems, unemployment insurance systems are? And what do you do? And ultimately, my suggestion was you ought to have some sort of a point at which you sort of say, look, we'll create a government job for you because we really do think it's important that you do some work. Now, not everyone agrees with this, and indeed, I'm very eloquent about talking about the limitations of such a plan, but that's less what I want to talk about here. Ultimately, what was passed was something I really disliked intensely. The Republicans ended up passing, the president signed a bill that had time limits and no guarantee of jobs after a time limit was reached. All right, well, what happened? In the first few years, poverty fell dramatically as we measure it. Employment rates rose dramatically. If you take the least educated women, their rates of employment suddenly shot up from about 30% up to 55% just in the course of a couple of years. Black poverty rates reached their lowest thing ever since we've been collecting such information, which was the sort of mid to late 60s. And so in many respects, it was a success. But there are a number of lessons that I would like to offer. By the way, it was a success in spite of the fact, by the time this was passed, I was out of office and strongly urged the president to veto the bill that he signed. One of the things he claimed, by the way, was that once he signed this bill, welfare would no longer be a big political issue. And one of the striking things is he turned out to be right on that score. Okay, I want to just talk about a few lessons here, and then we can have some discussion. The first, it really looks like incentives matter. Now, you would expect an economist to actually believe that. But we radically changed the rewards to going to work. It used to be that if you went to work at a full-time job and counted in all the impact of lost benefits, a full-time job at the minimum wage, all the impact of lost benefits, and you would gain no more than about $1,000 a year for a full-time job. And by the way, you'd probably lose your health insurance, which was worth at least $1,000. So essentially, you had no reason to go to work whatsoever financially. After the reform was passed, the benefits, largely because of the earned income tax credit expansion, was something in the range of $7,000, and you wouldn't lose your health insurance. That's a huge, huge difference. And there is no question that part of what happened was those incentives mattered. But there were two other things that mattered at the same time. Well, one other thing that really, really mattered, and that was the economy. This, by just sheer luck, the thing was passed at the moment when the U.S. economy was at a place that people thought it could never be. Astonishingly low unemployment, lots of job growth. Businesses were going to prisons to hire people as they were being let out of prison to work for them. In general, that is not the first place businesses look for workers. And so it was an astonishingly good moment in the economy. But the other thing I would say is the message that what also changed was welfare offices themselves definitely did begin to change the business they were trying to be in. And in a context where work really did pay, this began to change. Second element, I'm going to put this in the context of HARS 5 in a minute. Well, let me stick with incentives matter one other point. One of the great challenges of social support is always what I call one of the helping conundrums. On the one hand, you want to give as much money as possible to the needy folks. On the other hand, you want to provide work incentives at the same moment. And the problem is, if you give people a lot of money and you give them a work incentive, you have to then phase it out quite slowly. And if it's a lot of money and you phase it out slowly, eventually you're giving like half the population a benefit, which turns out to be very, very expensive, which then has to be offset by high taxes, which creates other problems. So what do you do about that? One of the interesting features about this policy was it actually reinforced work in a very, very big way by using tax credits that were associated with work. You got nothing if you didn't work in terms of an earned income tax rate. There were still other benefits you could get on a time-only basis. But it really made work pay. And the make work pay part of the agenda, I think, is one that's really an important one. And it does help break the iron law. There's other things you can do, like Arts 4 does. You can certainly insist that people go to work if they can find a job, things of that sort. Second, this is not a strategy for saving money. If your goal is to actually make a work-oriented reform that is designed to reduce poverty, it's almost certainly going to cost you money and not save you money. And one of the great challenges of European reform is most reform comes at a crisis, of a financial crisis. And therefore the goal is simply to cut back as opposed to think about ways to, to really help. We're actually spending more on social policy, not less. It's just spent differently. Much more of the money is focused on working folks and somewhat less on non-working folks. That third lesson is that changing the culture of an institution may be your biggest challenge and the hardest thing of all. But the last point I would just make is many people hoped that this would be, by getting people into a first job, it would start them off on a ladder, and each step on the ladder they would have upward mobility. The evidence now is remarkably clear that this was a step up onto a platform. What we did was take some people whose payments were slightly below our poverty line, push them slightly above it, and therefore seemingly reduce poverty. But this was not a radical, it was a radical change for them in the sense many more were working, but it was not a radical working outside the home, but it was not a radical change in their income. It certainly was not a way of narrowing the income distribution or dealing with inequality. And going forward, the really, really hard challenge, not only in the United States, but just talking with some folks here, everywhere, is how do you create genuine upward mobility? How do you find ways that people honestly can get onto a ladder and rise up across that ladder and keep growing and going? This becomes all the more important in the face of the demographic changes that are being seen, especially in Europe. I mean, where here you have total fertility rates of 1.4. For those of you that are weak on biology, you need to have each woman having 2 children in order to break even, and if you have some problems with that, you can ask some folks afterwards how that works. But 2, if you're down at 1.4, it means your population is going to be declining pretty rapidly unless you have immigrants. And so there are a lot of immigrants, but immigrants tend to be poor, they tend to be poorly educated, they tend not to respond as well to traditional systems, and so mobility becomes even more important in that context, more closely. I would just say a couple of other points and open up for reactions and thoughts. I spent a little bit of time learning more about the Hearts 4 experience and so forth, and in some ways it's very different, and in some ways it's very similar. Some of the broad contextual goals and so forth ring true and ring differently. And one of the things that I certainly am intrigued by is people's reaction to it. Obviously, it's been highly variable, and especially interested in what impact it's had on people's behavior. But I am struck by the incentive questions. Hearts 4 seems to me to be an example of trying to save money as much as anything, and leaves people with, at the margin, often very little incentive to work much beyond a certain level. And so I'm just interested in what that's been like and what your experience has been there. The second point I would just make is the best reforms are actually quite clear on what their objectives are. This reform, for good or for ill, had made the decision that they thought it was appropriate and reasonable to expect people to do some work outside the home. Now, a lot of people would say that's ridiculous. The most important thing a society can do is nurture its children. And in this case, they're largely single mothers. They should stay at home and nurture their children. It's a terrific argument. It just turns out that 93% of the American public does not agree with it. This kind of reform, one pollster told me, was more popular than the American flag. So I'm not suggesting the American flag should be popular or anything else, but I'm just reporting in the United States it is. After all, I can't imagine any other country where a political candidate would be chastised for not wearing a pin with the flag of their country at all times. But it does mean, it was very clear, the goal of this reform was to move people towards work and support and supplement that kind of work activity. What gets to be a problem is if you're simultaneously trying to lower the cost, and on the one hand, you want people to work, but you're not sure when, and then life gets much more complicated. I'm not going to say much more than that, except to offer one final point. I mentioned that Bill Clinton, when he signed the welfare reform bill, he said that this will change the politics of low-income assistance in this country. And in that case, he turned out to be completely right. A staple of all political discussion in the United States has always been a discussion about the people on assistance. And it was never pretty. Reporters would sometimes call me up and say, gee, there isn't that much talk going on about welfare this election a few years back. Isn't that terrible? And I'd say, no, this is actually wonderful. This is like terrific, because when there's talk about it, it's always bad and misleading and dangerous. It seems to me that the fundamental issue here is that it changed the perception. All of a sudden, there was much talk about child care, there was much talk about a lot of things. I since went on, before there was even welfare reform, I would go on talk shows and talk about how if you work, you shouldn't be poor. About how people would lose their jobs because they got sick or whatever else and nothing could happen and so forth. And the striking feature was, I then didn't get a single angry phone call. And so I leave with the simple point that setting a very clear set of high values and expectations, something that some of my colleagues here have talked about, a set of moral values as a starting point. And starting from there, if you work, you shouldn't be poor. We want to find a way to make, to really give people a genuine hand up. Those kinds of things were every bit as important as the analysis and everything else that came from it. Let me just stop there, and I would mostly appreciate learning more about your experience with HARS 4 and everything else. But simply to say this, this is not the moment I would recommend saying, gee, the European welfare states should have a lot to learn from the United States. I think most in the United States are jealous of many of the qualities, except on two elements. Don't forget, you do want to find ways to really make work for people. That is a fundamentally challenging thing, and it's getting increasingly difficult. And if we don't find a way to do it, if we don't find a real way to create upward mobility and so forth, especially in a time of growing inequality, I think the challenges ahead will be very great indeed. Thank you very much.